Good afternoon to each and every one. Thank you very much for being here. I'm very pleased to open the 11th edition of the Alberico Gentili Lectures, an annual appointment which presents a series of 3 lectures on comparative constitutional law in the broadest sense. This year's guest, that I'm truly glad to have here in Macerata for the first time, is the Honorable Péter Paczolay, Judge of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. I thank him very heartedly for having accepted our invitation and for honoring this lectureship with his presence. Peter joins the now long lineup of keynote speakers who have delivered the Alberico Gentili lectures over the years. Before getting, more familiar with Péter, I would like also to thank the rector of our university, John McCourt, for being with us today. And I'm giving him the floor just for his remarks. And thank you very much again for being here.
Thank you, Benedetta. I will be very quick. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Péter Paczolay, our esteemed guest for these 3 lectures that will take place today and over the next 2 days. The Alberico Gentili lectures are an extremely important part of our academic year. They are a highlight, one of the highlights of our academic year, and that is all thanks to the effort and the commitment of Benedetta Barbizan, Professor Barbizan, who has always brought us excellent guests to speak on various topics, and this year is no exception, when you will hear talks under the general title of the Universality of Human Rights. But in previous years, last year, we were happy to have Wojciech Sadurski, the year before Silvana Sciarra, the Presidente della Corte Costituzionale, Sonia Sotomayor from the US Supreme Court, and so on. I won't give you all the names, also because probably Benedetta will illustrate who has been here over the years. It's also a way to remember a really important figure, that is Alberico Gentili, who, of course, came from this part of the world, who fled this part of the world so that he could follow his studies. He was not terribly keen on the religious situation in Macerata back in the 16th century. And he went on to hold a chair of international law, as you probably know, at the University of Oxford. And so he is a trailblazer in the world of international law and in the terms of international law in the world. And so it is correct that we claim our connection here in Macerata with this key figure. We talk a lot, correctly, about Padre Matteo Ricci, who was also a trailblazer of his own, but equally Alberico Gentili merits our continued attention today. And thanks to Professor Barbizan, his memory and his huge output and his many insights are kept alive and are seen to be relevant today. The theme, the overriding theme of this week's lecture couldn't be more necessary. The question of human rights in a world which sees the rise of populism, in a world which is afflicted by war in various parts, and the necessity that human rights somehow be preserved, and that international law and the rules and regulations of international law somehow can be implemented is our key themes. And nobody better than Péter Paczolay can help us to understand these themes from his experience in Hungary, from his experience as ambassador here in Italy, and his current experience at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. So on behalf of the university, I want to thank Professor Barbizan, and I want to thank our guest very, very kindly for being here with us this week. It's a real honour and a privilege to have you with us, and we look forward to listening to your talks this week. Thank you, and I hope you all make full use of this great opportunity, which is non è scontato, which we have been able to organise here at the University of Macerata. Thank you.
One of the key features of the Alberico Gentili lectures is to introduce the 3 lectures, the series, with a conversation between myself and the keynote speaker, something that we are going to do in a moment. And we'll move downstairs to do that. But before this moment, I would like to tell you something, to familiarize with our guest. Péter Paczolay was born in Budapest and graduated in law in 1980 from the Eötvös Loránd University. My pronunciation, couldn't be, more wrong, probably. In 1989, he obtained his a PhD in political and legal science from the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Between 1991 and 1992, he was research fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. In 2000, he became full professor at the University of Budapest, at the Faculty of Law, and at the same time at the University of Szeged, at the Faculty of Law and Political Science. In the same year, 2000, he was appointed deputy head of the office of the President of the Republic by President Ferenc Madl, and then promoted to the post of head of the office under President László Solyom. In 2006, the Hungarian parliament elected him judge of the Constitutional Court, where he held the position of senior legal advisor to the president from 1990 to 1996. In 2008, he became president of the Constitutional Court, where he served until 2015. In the 2 following years, 2016 and 17, he was accredited in Rome as ambassador of Hungary to Italy, Malta, and San Marino, an office he left when, in April 2017, he was elected as the Hungarian judge at the European Court of Human Rights, where he had served in various capacities within the Venice Commission since 1993. His research interests encompass the history of political theory, the history of the concept of state and law, comparative constitutional law, and the role of law in social governance. Let me mention just the honors awarded to Péter Paczolay, which include, among others, Grande Ufficiale of the Italian Order of Merit, die große Verdienstkreuz mit Stern der Verdienstordens of the German Republic, and Commandeur de la Légion d'honneur de la République française. So I would like to ask you, after having thanked you very much for your presence here today, to join me in a round of applause to welcome Judge Péter Paczolay. I think it's time to move downstairs. Okay, thank you very much. I was thinking this morning that after 11 editions of the Alberico Gentili lectures, maybe it's time for me to deliver a questionnaire. The Alberico Gentili lectures questionnaire, like Bernard Pivot's questionnaire, like Marcel Proust's questionnaire in France. But this conversation normally opens the series of lectures just in order to allow students that gather here in this audience to get more acquainted with the figure, that they may read among the names preceding the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. But behind that name, behind that professional expertise, there is normally, not always, but certainly in this case, a law professor, or a person, a student, that picked law as his major, and before then, a child that was brought under socialism in Hungary in the 50s and 60s. So, I mean, the Alberico Gentili Lectures questionnaire normally opens with the first question. What kind of childhood did you have in Hungary, in Budapest, if I get it right? And what kind of education did you receive from your family?
Yes, I was born in Budapest, and I was educated there. My childhood, honestly being, socialism was completely different from the Western world, but nevertheless, for a child was, how to say, it was not bad at all. So, I mean, it was poverty. We didn't have too much to joke, to play with, etc. But otherwise, it was interesting. As regards education, the problem what we have to face, or a lot of families had to face, was called double education, because of course there was a value system in the family, like moral values, like religious values, that were denied by the official system, the official government, and the education in the school was, how to say, following the line of the Communist Party, while the education at home was very often focusing on traditional moral values, not the values of the, as they called it, the international proletariat, and religious values that were not, I mean, churches were working in Hungary, but how to say, officially at the schools, etc., the education was completely atheist. But most of us, I think, could manage this so-called double education and separate the traditional values of the family from what was taught in the school, which mostly we didn't take it seriously, just accepted as obligatory. Of course, if I look back now, when I was born in '56, just in the year of the Hungarian Revolution against the Soviet Union, it was 11 years after the beginning of this new system. And now, at over 60, I look back, 11 years are not too much. So I mean, the family traditions, etc., they could be kept and remained. Otherwise, it was nice. I liked my school. It was a musical school where a professor, a close family of our, a close friend of our family, was, so to say, the right hand of the famous Hungarian compositor Zoltán Kodály. So as I have to say that I was singing for Zoltán Kodály on his birthday, because this professor of music brought me as well there, even if my, how to say, my voice not very close to Pavarotti or other singer.
Okay, and why did you pick law? Because some of your predecessors here on this chair, they said that they decided to study law either because they wanted to change the world, or because they wanted to fight inequalities, or because they wanted to contribute to fostering a culture of fundamental rights. I mean, this depends on the kind of background they come from. Which was your inspiration to pick law instead of other subjects?
I try not to disappoint the audience, but I was interested in everything, but mostly in humanities. But then the pressure in the family, my father was, at that time, was a possibility to be economist and lawyer. At the same time, there was the combined education. So he graduated there because he was interested in international law, in international affairs. Of course, because of his political background, he couldn't fulfill this, so to say, dreams. But nevertheless, he advised me not to go just to humanities. And at that time, law was, so to say, the jolly joker. It was very difficult to get in. There was a system, you had to have, the maximum was 20 points. And with the 19.5 points, I just could enter the university. So it's very competition to enter. And but then you could use for whatever the law diploma, famous movie and theater directors, actors, television figures, etc., writers, and so on. Those had also law degree. Also, it's funny. From now, look back, that at that time we could have only one diploma. When some of us wanted to graduate, for example, in sociology, then the official answer was that this country is not rich enough to give two graduate education to one person. This then changed in the second half of the 80s, but when I graduated, when I was going to university between 75 and 80, that was only one. Then, honestly speaking, during socialism, law was not very, not that very interesting. It was basically law was a tool in the hand of politics. Of course, there were differences because private law was, I mean, in classical private law was very well prepared. The first Hungarian civil code was adopted only in 1959. We used just even until 59 just customary law, or in certain periods the Austrian civil law. And so my interest therefore turned from the very beginning toward the history. Because, for example, to deal with constitutional law made no sense. This constitutional law was something empty. It was just a decoration in the socialist legal system. So I was dealing with the history of legal and political ideas. It interested me very much. I was especially dealing with Machiavelli. So I wrote both my diploma work and also my PhD on the concept of state in Machiavelli. And then we published with my friend in '84 first comprehensive history of political ideas, which was already very interesting. I was just thinking back, because all histories of political or whatever ideas in socialist countries had to finish with the chapter on Marxism-Leninism, because the whole history was just introducing the Marxism-Leninism as the top of what human intelligentsia can produce. And then we put the chapter on Marx and Engels to the 19th century, where it belongs. Then there was this huge problem at the publishing house with the editor, but finally they did that. We cannot do that if we don't want to put at the end as the theological the end of the theological development of ideas, then they will leave it out, saying that with Marxism-Leninism we cannot deal with one chapter because entire disciplines like scientific socialism, etc., deal with the subject. So, but now, even thinking back at 83, 84, I'm a bit surprised that the official publishing house accepted this argument. Nevertheless, this became then, I mean, later on, we didn't put the chapter back to, I a little bit regret it. My friend was writing the chapter, it was very interesting, a very different view on the political ideas of Marx, how Marx saw, for example, the role of Russia in Europe, etc., and so on, but this was interesting. And then, of course, so I didn't have a, how to say,
vocation for law.
Yes, for
okay. Okay. But did you, I mean, when you were a student or a PhD student, did you look for mentors? I mean, some figures that could represent something meaningful to you. And did you find any?
Yes, that's maybe might sound strange. I once was interviewed whether I prefer red wine or white wine. And I said that I prefer definitely red wine. And then they asked me, then why are you Vin Chevalier in a territory where they produce only white wines? Then, this little bit as well, because my mentors were coming from civil law, so not that much from public law, and from civil law, because the civil law professors were outstanding. So there was a civil law school in Hungary, and some of the professors remained, of course, with compromises, very active during socialist times. And then, for example, you mentioned Professor Mádl, Ferenc Mádl, who became later the President of the Republic. He was one of my mentors. I liked him very much. I was dealing with, when I graduated, with the international commercial law. Also, of course, during the times when the monopoly of the export-import was a monopoly of the state. It was not a free market economy, but it was very interesting, and he had a great influence on me. He was the first who published a book on the common market, and the motto of the book was that fabula detta narratur, and this was censored. That has nothing to do with the common market. So it's not even dream that this fairy tale will become one true. So it was very interesting to work with him. I'm sorry that I'm jumping here and there, when Hungary entered the European Union and when he was president.
Okay, yes. And what did you like or do you like of teaching? And which, according to you, are the most important qualities for a professor?
I saw, as I started quite young, so after 3 years working in a export-import foreign commerce company, I returned to the university. So I became, so to say, teacher quite soon. Basically, my contemporaries were the students, and of course that was a different relation. And I tried to keep it that even later on, so I was quite very close to the students. After some time, some decades, I experienced that the students don't call me anymore on my first name and so on, so I tried to encourage them, but also accepted it, so that there's also age difference, etc., etc. So I was not the classical German cathedra professor. So then I realized, getting older, that it's very good both for the health, for the mind, and for everything to be among young people. And when I became ambassador and I had to finish teaching, I was invited to have a lecture almost every month in universities of Rome, etc. But that was, then I realized that to have seminars and lectures every week is not a burden, but it's for me was almost necessary. So what I missed, the every week contact with students, not to give lectures, but I had the possibility, but I missed the everyday contact with the students, and that I liked very much.
How would you describe the job of judge that you did in the Hungarian Constitutional Court and in the European Court of Human Rights, which are two very different legal environments? But how would you describe this job? What is very difficult in doing a job, and what is very rewarding?
Yeah, of course, I always emphasize, so I will also during my lectures, that for me the real judge is the the judge who is, let's call it so the ordinary judge who is exercising the ordinary jurisdiction. I was never a real judge in this sense because I came from the academic. Of course, the Constitutional Court, as here in Italy, also in Hungary, is composed both of judges coming from the ordinary judiciary, coming from the academic field and from other practices, advocates and so on. So I have always a huge respect for judges who are working really on an everyday basis on the legal system and adjudicating the cases and controversies among the parties. Then, of course, being a constitutional judge is different. Also, and at the European Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights is different again. This I realize from the following. With the relation with the judges coming from the judiciary, they had a different view of the constitutional supremacy. So they were, not all of them, not necessarily, but they were more inclined to compare the law that was under adjudication and the Constitution. So if there was a discrepancy, that they tried to look at as the problem with the Constitution and not with the law. But so therefore, for them that was a difficulty, because in our continental system they have to apply the law. And it took decades to educate the judges that they can raise constitutional problems, constitutional issues when applying a law. But this, I think, worked. At the European Court of Human Rights is even more difficult. First of all, because we were 47 with the Russian judge, now we have 46 judges coming from completely different backgrounds, different legal cultures, not only legal, but different political and social cultures, countries, really very huge differences among us. Then the individual careers are very different. Some people basically have the first great chance to achieve something, to become well-known even at domestic or at international level. For some of us, like me, this is the last act of my career, so we are not so tensed what comes next, etc., etc. I'm especially lucky because I will leave the court 3 weeks before my 70th birthday, when otherwise I should have to finish all my activities both at the university or at the Strasbourg court, because that's a strict age limit. The 70s, so it's different. And of course, also here, what will be also my topic of, especially the lecture of tomorrow, the relation of an international court to a domestic legal system, to domestic authorities, makes very, very interesting and very challenging this work. So, as a constitutional judge, my idea was to be very strict with the legislator. So I mean, set up standards that the Hungarian Constitutional Court set up at the very beginning from 90 on, and then to keep these standards at that high level, even though the changing composition of the court, more and more compromises with the politics and with legislator were working against it. So I tried, even in difficult times when the government had a 2/3 majority in the parliament, when you might rightly ask what is then the sense of constitutional review if the legislator can overrule the judgments of the Constitutional Court. So that was that we also addressed, because we had also problem with the standards of the Strasbourg court, which of course try to find the minimal common denominator and not elevate the standards irrationally. But so that was my, when I left, I think, of course, history can judge whether during my 7 years of presidency the court could stand the standards or not, but I hope that yes. Here in the International Court, I have other, it's, how to say, it's a continuation of my work at the Venice Commission that I started in '93, and we were examining the laws, pieces of legislation of the member states, and so on. And it was a very interesting and challenging work, comparative constitutional law on an everyday basis. Of course, not a profession, but how to say, there's a volunteering in the Venice Commission. And here now we adjudicate on the cases, but somehow I found a continuation of my previous work, and only that we address cases and controversies, as the US Constitution would say, and not the abstract review of the legislation that much, but also there are developments in this sense. So I think that for a judge, it's for me it's very important to balancing, not only in the sense of balancing between rights, etc., but balancing between the legal values, the moral values, and also being aware of the political context. As regards law and politics, as mentioned in socialism, law was the tool of politics, and we were fighting in the 80s, those in opposition, not to have law as a mere tool of the political power, but develop an independent, autonomous legal system based on legal values, on the values that the Western democracies and legal systems shared and were based on, and so on. And when I started to work with the Constitutional Court, and also I was in the United States to explore judicial review in the American Constitution, I realized that this goal was very good and very well put, to liberate the legal system from political influence. But then I learned that law is very closely interlinked with politics. So, and then also my book on this judicial review issues was that judicial review or constitutional adjudication between law and politics. So then, after my naive period of free law from politics, I realized that, I mean, you can say that I am not under political influence. Of course, let's say on everyday party politics level, that might be true, but otherwise I think that the judge so has to take into, and it's under willing, cannot avoid to be a political actor.
Before leaving you the floor for delivering the first lecture, I have always a final question. It's always the same. What piece of advice do you have for our students here? For their present, and especially for the future they are building for themselves?
No, my personal experience, if I may share with you, was that I was coming from a family on classical values based on classical, etc. And in the socialist system, I was hoping to, how to say, to get to survive somehow with the socialist system. And of course, I know, especially. Didn't want and never entered the Communist Party, so I saw that my future is limited. It might be okay, so it's not, was especially in Hungary, the system was already open up for a lot of political liberalism, open up for a limited market economy. At least the private property was allowed, a certain kind of private property, etc., private commerce, and so on. So I don't want to depict the Hungarian socialist system as completely black. But I thought that I will work at this the university. Ask me every year whether I want to step into the party, but I don't know, not at all, etc. But I could achieve everything. I made my PhD, but this was this was a German system. So here you received the degree from the academy after you did already something, so not after the university. So so I was even in '89 having a career that was satisfying, and that was my purpose. Nobody knew. Even some people say that they had some ideas that socialism will never will finish. Honestly speaking, we didn't think at all that the socialism will change in our life. And then things changed. And also we had some role in it and so on. And then basically, even if I mentioned that I was interested in the humanities, I was not dreaming that I will become the Chief Justice of my country or of anything, or the World Court or whatever. So basically I think that I achieved everything what Hungarian law students could not even dream, because we didn't know these institutions when I became president. And the Strasbourg court, of course, we have heard of it, but was not for us, and so on. And so how to say, Napoleon is not my favorite political figure, but nevertheless, but I would say that basically everybody has the possibility to become a marshal. So, so tutti i soldati hanno il bastone di maresciallo nel zaino. It was easier to translate from French to Italian. So that I think that, and then thinking of that I can become what really I want, just to invest in that direction, and I think that it's not only in my case, a lot of others it works.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I'll leave you the floor for delivering the first lecture, and thank you very much again for being here, and enjoy the first of this series. Thank you very much, Péter.
So I go. Thank you. So I speak, don't know, 1.5. Okay, then you could see that we have 3 different but very closely connected topics. I have to say that rereading my notes, the first lecture on the universality of human rights, it's a bit theoretical, even for my taste. But tomorrow and the third day will much more focusing on issues of the case law and practices. Of course, the topic is very large, in very extended. So I think that I focus, besides my theoretical concepts and my experiences, to what I'm close to as a judge of the Strasbourg court. I think it's adequate to focus, especially during the second and third more practical lecture, to the case law of the Strasbourg court, also present how the Strasbourg court, because otherwise I will hear the international jurisdictions, for example, so I could go to whatever courts, but I think it's much more authentic if I share my personal experiences with you as far as possible. So how came this universality of human rights? Of course, this is a topic, basically everybody has an idea about it. It's very often recalled. But I see that nowadays, in the last decades, after the very nice period of the after Second World War decades, late 40s, 50s, 60s, even if we go to the late 80s or early 90s, when the democracy, rule of law, and the human rights were expanded to almost the entire Europe. Fortunately, let's say since the 2000 or the last 2 decades, even in the last 2 decades, the human rights problem was addressed not with that optimism that before, and also the events, political events of the last years, at least for me, they were really very seriously touching upon the system of the defense of human rights. To make it more, how to say, to bring you closer, what my idea was, I always go back to the history, as I mentioned, that I basically started as a historian of ideas and of institutions. So when I say that what is the universality of human rights, how it comes to the table? It came, and this is a common consensus on that, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948, that in itself had a very interesting history, how different cultures and different political systems and the representatives of this system under the, so to say, the direction of Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of the former American president, put together a document which realized all these, let's say, ideals and even dreams that humanity constructed during the previous centuries. But then human rights became a part of the international legal system, but this experience in this field was contradictory. Let's just think of the following. How the standards of the protection of human rights can vary from regions, from cultures, from continents, and so on, even if they are declared universal. Or secondly, how differently human rights are valued according to different cultures and ideologies, and how diverse the implications of the protection of human rights are when we not only declare human rights but to defend them. After World War II, the first time in the history, international courts with obligatory jurisdiction were created, and they not only accepted the universality of human rights, but they were able to enforce human rights in the respective countries and legal systems. But this development, this positive development, was burdened from the very beginning with contradictions, theoretical and practical contradictions that later on might jeopardize the success of this development of human rights. Just mention 3 of them. For example, that this universality of human rights after the Second World War was based also on the revival of natural law in an age now or at least for a century or 2 centuries ruled exclusively by the legal positivism, that law is what is adopted and written law. Secondly, the rise of supranational organizations, international courts, of an age after centuries of the Westphalian international system that was based exclusively on sovereign states, and on the international relation of sovereign states, and not on supranational supra-sovereignty institutions. And the third is the very well-known dilemma of the majoritarian democracy and the limits set on the majoritarian will by rule of law and also by the non-majoritarian judicial bodies that is always beyond the scenes. So the historical antecedents of this development actually goes back to the necessary, we have to start from the Enlightenment period, or even from the previous, from the 17th, 18th century, when the concept of the man and the concept of the right was elaborated, basically by the natural law theories that presumed a state of nature where the man is an individual in this state of nature and as individual has rights that first of all the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. This was first elaborated by Thomas Hobbes in 1640 in the Leviathan, and then turned into a much more democratic or liberal way by John Locke in the second treatise on government, obviously works that you are very well familiar. So anyway, the Hobbes created the individual as this natural origin of the history, and later on by the social contract, political power was created because of the disorganization of the free and autonomous individuals. Then Locke, speaking to rise to life, liberty, property, and the social contract, saying that people enter into a social contract in order to create a power, but also to put the limits on this power and protect at least these three basic rights. And then this, at that time, by the way, rather isolated theories slowly replaced the ruling political theory of the Middle Ages and the early modern ages, namely the divine right of the king, because that was basically the gave legitimacy to the power, to the king, that it's deriving from God, their power, and this was replaced by a power created by the men themselves, also in protecting, according to the Lockean scheme, their liberties. Then all these rights of man later became the human rights. It's not really clear what was the change. The human rights wanted maybe to undermine a little bit rhetorically the importance that these human rights are of the whole human race shares the same rights. Of course, nowadays, from the 20th century, if we look back, then we see clearly this development of the rights of man and derived from the natural law as the antecedent of the later human rights system. But at their times, they were accepted very critically. So the legal positivism that became really the ruling approach to law was very critical, said that this is nice, but this is a theory that cannot be proved. Hume already asked, who can prove that men make, among others, a social contract? Who saw the social contract? Jeremy Bentham in the 19th century was even more cruel when said that right is the child of law. So from real laws come real rights. But from imaginary laws, like from laws of nature, come imaginary rights. So then was that your right is based on a real law, or your right is based on a speculation. A speculation and the state of nature and natural law deriving from whatever authority above the man. So, therefore, not entering into more deeply into this historical argumentation, I would say that the cornerstone of the University of Human Rights was when human rights from these imaginary laws, laws of nature, etc., were turned into concrete, enforceable, as Bentham would say, real rights. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was still not a document that was enforceable. It remains, even for nowadays, soft law, international soft law, a declaration, as also the name says, it was a declaration. But nevertheless, it was very important because it was a universal declaration that tried to combine Indian, Chinese, Russian, or so to say Soviet traditions with Western traditions. The persons who created, who drafted the documents came from these different cultural and philosophical backgrounds. And so I think that the Universal Declaration was still a declaration, but nevertheless it became a universally, this declaration tried to embody ideas and goals, but they didn't provide concrete framework for achieving them. So, anyway, the functional University of Human Rights depends on human rights providing attractive remedies, enforceability, and against the most pressing systemic threats to human dignity and all the universal values on which the Universal Declaration was built up. But, so it has it had a great role in the sense that the idea of university was widespread, but was not still enough. Then came the regional conventions, and the European Convention of Human Rights in 1950, but even before it was very important historical change that the Council of Europe was created, was established, but first time by 10 Western European countries, already after the break with the communist world. But anyway, I will speak of this much more tomorrow. It was the first international institution that was above the sovereign states, and the sovereign states accepted, at least to a certain extent, that this international body can enforce its decisions on the sovereign states and governments. How to say, I am, of course, now also speaking on behalf, to a certain extent, of the court, where I am a judge of the Strasbourg court, but I have to say that I am several times very critical with the Strasbourg court, especially I was very critical before. My mother, when she was not a lawyer but followed my writings, etc., she told me that I'm surprised that you were elected to this court because you were speaking of them so ugly things before. I saw that they were not adjudicating what I was writing before, but so I'm not, how to say, making rhetoric for the court, but even the critics of the courts and the international literature compared to this history that I just made a few remarks on so far, thought that the European Convention of Human Rights was a regional convention, actually giving possibility to the individuals living on the territory of the member states to defend themselves against the intervention of the state in their individual liberties and freedoms. But nevertheless, it was also, all these rights were considered universal rights. So the European Convention was not only considered as a regional document, but an universal document, because it conferred, of course, certain political rights on the inhabitants of the member states, but it claimed that these rights are moral rights for everyone as well, so moral rights for everyone as well, and therefore they can be called human rights. So here we have, I just now mentioned this, and I will come back the following days to this issue, that this was, according to literature, I have to say it's not my propaganda for the court, that this was the first time when a document conferred concrete rights to the individuals for the defense of their rights against the interference of the state, but also stated these rights as universal moral rights that otherwise would be applicable to all other human beings. But of course, the mechanism, the enforceability mechanism, was reduced to the member states of the Council of Europe. And I mentioned that here you might feel somehow a tension between a legal positivist system when Bentham and his followers, basically all lawyers, might ask whether your rights are based on a real law or not. And on the fact that the introduction of human rights after World War II necessarily was based on a kind of revival of natural law. As in the positivist system, it was basically impossible to speak of the responsibility, for example, of German Nazi soldiers, politicians, policemen, etc., or because they were following the positive law. They were following the positive law. They were implying the legal rules that were adopted according the Constitution, according the existing rules, not in violation of the existing rules. So according to in the strictly legal positive system, which were absolutely prevailing in all European countries, it was not possible to start the trials in Nuremberg against the responsible persons for all these atrocities and so on. And it's very interesting to see, and in our teaching of legal philosophy, put a lot of emphasis on this revival of natural law, especially on the figure of the famous German philosopher Gustav Radbruch, who was clearly one of the representatives of the German legal positivist philosophy. And then when he was faced on what ground can be put on trial in Nuremberg by the Allies, he introduced this idea of the so-called relativized natural law, saying that legal certainty is not enough for a system. Legal certainty does not entirely give ground and for a legal system. Also, justice has to play a role. And he said in his words that the human rights are superior to all written legal doctrines. These are inalienable and unquestionable rights which deny the validity to the criminal commands of inhuman tyrants. So there is a certain one when you have to accept the law, and you have to follow the law. But if the law becomes inhuman what the law orders, or those who speak for the law order through inhuman things, then you have the obligation not to follow but reject the law. And this was what he called that there are, turning back to natural law that states that there are moral rules that are above all the legal system, that are eternal and valid everywhere. That was what basically legal positivism wanted to exclude from the everyday operation of law. And now he had to return to this idea that there are certain final moral values that cannot be violated, that are not linked to the strict legal system of each country, but that are valid for everybody and everywhere and all times. Of course, this created a certain tension, and therefore I mentioned it as one of the contradictions that were there at the beginning of the birth of these universal values. So, the universal values on one hand became really important when the universalistic values became positive rights that can be enforced. So for me, this is the turning point in the history of human rights and universality or relativity of human rights. Of course, this was not solved. I mean, these declarations remain a lot of cases declarations. If we look around the world, we see the mass violations of individual rights, diverse forms of human suffering, discrimination, terrorist acts, genocides during war or civil wars. So we can see that the assertion of rights is an ongoing struggle. So this is not solved at a theoretical, not even a practical phase. This is a continuous challenge. The consequence of skepticism about values is the secondary status of human rights, especially in relation to economic interest. So when we see at these sufferances, mass violations, mass killings in not only in other continents, in Africa, in Asia, etc., but also we see these wars or these frozen territories problems in Europe and so on, then really we are surprised, and sometimes you have to face that economic interest is overrules human rights and the universality of human rights. And this is another tension that it puts a very serious stamp on this development of the universality. Still, I see that the reference to the value element of law, the moral element in law, appears in the concept of human rights, and this should be kept on, should be continued, and international level, but I think, and at least this was a very important development in the European countries after World War II, in constitutionalism. So the transformation of natural law principles and values, including moral principles, into man-made positive law. So therefore, I think that after World War II, with the creation of international courts, and therefore I say, for example, there's the International Criminal Courts, the rather recent development. International Criminal Courts is not accepted by some of the biggest countries in the world. Never, for example, concretely speaking nowadays of Russia. And, but the European Court of Human Rights was accepted by all, all European countries, with the exception those like Belarus, who was not able to enter the Council of Europe, and Russia, that left the Council of Europe or was excluded. It's difficult to say. So, I mean, and let's say the Council of Europe excluded Russia, but with the conditions that Russia was asking for. So after half year, they discontinued to be members of the Council of Europe and of the European Court of Human Rights, which of course is a very negative turn in the history of this international court. On the other hand, Constitutional Court also had a very important role from Germany, Italy, following of course the forerunner Austria, then the new democracies, Spain, Portugal, and then in almost all countries of the Eastern Bloc that had a great role to say that the human rights, fundamental rights, liberties are not only declarations, but are rights. For the defense of them, you can go to the court, and the judge can give right to you, can oblige the state to not to interfere with your rights, and also to give just satisfaction or anything else for what the state committed against the individual. Also, moreover, as with the abstract review of legislation, also to have a control over the legislation, whether it's in conformity with the Constitution or not. So I think that this opened up a completely new period in the history of law, in the history of legal systems. It does not mean that everything is settled, not at all. First of all, because as we see, wars, important countries leaving the European community of the states, the Council of Europe, other countries leaving the community of the European Union, and United Kingdom also frightening continuously the Council of Europe that they leave because of the lack of certain requirements, etc., etc. And at national level as well, the danger is there that the political context changes. The constitutional courts maybe not defending that much the basic values and the rights of the individuals, might turn back, might be much more compromising with the government, and so on. So therefore, we used to say that, and I used to say that this, the rule of law, the defense of human rights is a continuous task. So it's not solved forever, not solved for the next years. It might be endangered at every moment, at every time. So it's a continuous fight, and this, I think, that should be kept in mind. Of course, the problem of the universalism is attacked and enlarged by those who say that universalism is a theoretical approach. The reality is much more regional or much more individual, depending on the particular states. Of course, the wave of globalization, the situation becomes even more complicated, because then we have only the difference and the tension between universal, the regional, or particular values, but also there is a globalization that affects very much the human rights, And of course, this paradoxical or certain extent strengthened the standards, the so-called universal standards, that consider the characteristics of all regions of the world without exception, and that they will be all general, abstract, go along with universal human rights standards, and the regional and national standards should just detail and justify them. So globalization, with all the contradictory effects it has, might also, how to say, give a certain impetus, and this is again a paradoxon that we see on approaching this issue, to human rights standardization, the unified, global, all-embracing characteristics of all countries and regions. And of course, if you accept that you go to buy the same products everywhere, and you go to the same shops and markets in all countries, that also it's easier to understand that also human rights are in this sense global, universal, and standardized. Rights that have emerged as universal rights are very common rules in the modern world, and in reality the principle of relations between individuals, communities, various state and supranational institutions can be combined in this picture. The more globalization is being implemented, the more growing the trend of this uniformizing and universalizing these rules, and of course this can hide away the contradiction between the common universal rules and the rules of the particular states. It establishes responsibility and builds its laws in accordance with the features of civilization, which have determined the living conditions for many hundred years. But again, what I see that even with the other developments, natural law, positive law, the return to natural law, here the universalism, the globalization is also has a might be contradictory effect. It has gives force to the acceptance of the universal values, but also that cannot hide and solve definitely the problem and the contradiction between universal, regional, and particular values. In these last two decades that I mentioned, it was not only, how to say, practical problems raising like human rights violations, wars, turns in the acceptance of rule of law, democracy, and human rights, but there's a very clear theoretical and practical schools or academicians, politicians, who clearly point out the problem of human rights, speaking first of all of the inflation of human rights and of the crisis of human rights, and they link together, of course, according to their political, how to say, standpoint, to this phenomena that can be taken as a proof for this inflation and crisis of human rights. Here again, I just repeat what I told 2 minutes ago, that the spread of human rights is not a linear process, is not a one-way street, the road that can be reserved. Even when in good times we don't think of it and we are very satisfied that things are going in the right direction. Never, unfortunately, they can be reversed, it can be turned back, and we have to fight for the level of protections we have already achieved, as I mentioned during the questionnaire period already. Was my personal belief and mandate also. Of course, as human rights development is not a straight line, it's a very complex process. Therefore, unfortunately, I have to say that phenomena, what is called democratic backlash, of course, is a disappointment, but unfortunately not a surprise. It's inherent in the system. It might happen, and logically happens as a reaction to the development, which otherwise was welcomed. And of course also, well, not my subject, but also the populism raises even again the more complicated question of democracy, legitimacy, and majority rule. And this follows from the diversity and ambiguity of the concept of human rights, of which I try to show some aspects. So we have come a long way from the protection of the inalienable rights of individuals, and now we have rights of the animals. We have the right to water, and this paradigm shift is that the concept of the state as a constraint has been extended to include an international dimension of rights protection, and that the new generation of human rights has increasingly imposed positive, active obligations on the state, which has become the main custodian of human rights protection, in addition, or instead being the enemy of human rights. Of course, this is a very well-known discourse, the different generations of human rights, from the basic individual rights, the classical individual rights, to life, the freedom to free speech, freedom of association and assembly, freedom of conscience and religion, and so on. And then the second generation of the political rights, electoral rights, the expansion of electoral rights as other political rights, or right to political participation, to arriving the third generation of social rights, cultural and other rights that, and here is the change from the classical model, the defense against the state, the rights serve as defense against the state, to rights that cannot be, how to say, solved without the help and without the active work of the state. So therefore also the state now is different, because the classical view, the state was basically the enemy of the individual rights, even if the state had a legitimate aim and a legitimate function. Nevertheless, it was always there, the danger that interferes with the individual rights, and the whole human rights protection system wanted to defend the individual against the state. It's nowadays with the positive rights, and it of course puts obligations, duties on the state. The state has to intervene, has to create the economic background for these rights. But also these critics refer to the fact that now there is an inflation of rights, that new and new rights are invented, and really the rights of the animals, the right to water, etc., were rights that were never in the mind of those who historically created and contributed to the development of the human rights concept. Here, now these critics say that the origin, that the proponents of classical concept of human rights are utopians, are utopies that because of the human rights have two-phased use. This is a practical and political argument that certain standards apply for the countries and certain other standards apply to countries outside of that region, and there is a division between the West and East, North and South, and also it's a quite well-known school that basically the human rights the spread of human rights around the world was actually a tool in the hand of colonialism. The other main criticism, the main line of criticism is that there is a breakdown in the theoretical basis of human rights. That was what I just very shortly I mentioned at the beginning. And here, one of the main, and I have to admit that strong arguments, is that the school of deconstruction in social sciences had an effect that undermined the acceptance of universal ideals, including human rights. Here, of course, they refer to the deconstruction theory and later on widespread school founded by Jacques Derrida in 1967 by his work on grammatology, which tried to explain that the word or these phenomena of the word are not a mixture of something, but is really the tension between things, between opposite things. So it's not a mixture, not a link together, but a tension between, for example, in the legal world, as the critical legal studies in the United States stated, opposition and tension between public and private, substantive and formal, and so on. And basically that the deconstruction ended up in a relativism, and as a deconstruction school was and has been very, very popular. It's basically arrived to all social and also other sciences. And for example, one of these critics mentioned the gender theory, where deconstruction's the teaching was that to underline that the opposition between men and women should be deconstructed. And since this postmodern turn, not only the social social phenomena of men, but also the biological gender became a social construct to be dismantled. And that has a very, very huge impact, as a matter of fact, on the understanding of human rights, both in relation of discrimination of men and women, or the different ways of what the LGBTQ, etc., movement raised. So there was this strong influence of the deconstruction that even if difficult to understand, probably for everyday people of everyday life, but basically ended up, according to critics, in a relativism against the universal acceptance of human rights. I just would like to mention one example of this very widespread literature that already one book which is interesting for me was written by Kostas Douzinas in 2000, The End of Human Rights. Already the title speaks for itself. It's interesting because Douzinas is not a right-wing thinker at all, and nevertheless he is very critical with the developments on the field of human rights in the recent decades. Among his main points of criticism are, first, that the natural rights revolution, I mean the acceptance of rights as the basis of our society, does not necessarily lead to a good and successful result. For example, the natural rights revolution that in the 18th century was accepted and became the ground of the Western European countries. Despite these results, after this natural rights revolution, more tyrannic systems were built in Europe than ever in the history. The Nazi system and so on, the fascist system and so on. This was after the human rights revolution and during the era of the divine right of kings and other ideologies. The tyrants were not so systematically inhuman that these dictatorships that were raised out as Nazi Germany from the Weimar Republic, from a constitutional system based on the results of the human rights revolution. His second example is the changes after 89 and 90 in former communist countries that led to the establishment of mafia-ruled governments there, the destruction of cultures and peoples in those countries by the globalist market. And basically, instead of, how to say, the stupid and tyrannic rule of the communist parties, these people are now ruined by the global market or the culture became this globalized and uniformized culture. His other argument is that this praise of international and humanitarian law led to a dichotomy of the great powers regarding their behavior towards other states. What he wants basically to say that certain powers, Western countries, disregard the sovereignty of other countries in defense of human rights, while ignore the violations of human rights in their own countries. So the double standard when Western countries interfere on the basis of universal human rights in the life of course, not very democratic states, but they don't care for the violations of human rights in their own countries. And then third argument of him, of Douzinas, is that human rights will become an instrument of political conflict. So I mean, for mere political reasons, military, whatever reasons, human rights can be used as a justification, as a tool that's saying that we, because of the human rights violation, we interfere, we attack you, etc. Then his fourth argument is that the human word has no meaning. You can attach it to everything, to all kinds of labels, and therefore in political campaigns it's very popular to use the human adjective because in itself does not have any meaning, so you can use for whatever reasons you think. Then another problem he sees, this cultural relativism, and basically universal morality and cultural relativism has a very difficult and very sensitive relation. The cultural relativism might be associated to nations, castes, tribes, whatever other kind of communities, and this has a very, very difficult and very complex relation. Then, as we go, he goes closer to the catalogue of human rights. he realizes that we are creating more and more rights. But these more and more rights focusing on certain particularities of the man remove the integrities of the person, remove the integrities of the human person. They tear apart the body, says Douzinas, and the rights to abortion, same-sex marriage, etc., is that we create more and more rights, but not in the defense of the holiness of the human person, but to a certain very particular aspect of the human person. And this means that the result is that we have more and more rights, and we became more and more defenseless because of this particularized word. So I'm not commenting on these critical arguments. I just wanted to show as an example. And of course, now you can put rightly the question, and then what would be the solution for these problems? And here I have to say, with all my respect, that he gives a clear answer how to cure these problems, and says that the remedy is a postmodern principle of justice. The postmodern vision focuses not on my rights, but on the other persons, on the rights of the other individual. The other individual, as he says, the only person existing in a given time and place, with gender, history, needs, and desires. What can survive deconstruction is the recognition of the uniqueness of the other person. Of course, this at first sight sounds very, not only utopic, but almost a religious approach that you must love your neighbor as yourself, or something like that, that we have already, we know very well. So it's problem is the difficult then to give the answer. Nevertheless, I think that there is a need to respond to the challenges that have undermined the faith in human rights. And there are even, let's say, less utopic or less rhetoric attempts for that to find possible answers. I would mention among these the need for a realistic approach to human rights. Rather than the more and more extreme practice of new rights or introducing new rights. Even if we do not deny that fundamental rights are above the will of majority at a given time, they cannot be permanently separated from the will of the majority of voters and the politicians that were elected by the people. A significant contribution to this response from a scientific theoretical point of view is the involvement of empirical social sciences in the broader contextualization of human rights based on international law. This is a rather serious school, but here again we see the dilemma, we see the tension that we say that, of course, human rights are to a certain extent untouchable. They are above the will of day-by-day majorities. Nevertheless, in the long run, you cannot completely deny or ignore the will of the majority of the voters and of the politicians elected by them. This I see, by the way, also in the work of the concrete courts. Of course, I have to admit that being at the Constitutional Court in face of a majority that basically can overrule you, of course not as an everyday practice, but nevertheless in very extreme situations. Of course that you think of compromises, compromises of defending the institution, and so on. So that also here at international level, I see within the court of Strasbourg certain approaches. That one is that we have to show to the world that for us a written text is not a problem, so we can invent new rights. On the other hand, there is a movement among the judges saying that we have to be much more calm. We have to respect the reality of the world, not to overemphasize things that are difficult to sell to the countries or even to sell to the everyday people, etc. Then there is another issue that is focusing on the identity, saying that the problem of the identity also was always on the agenda but was not explored. The marginalized groups of people, religious groups, even whole countries feel offended by the application of universal human rights, because they say that they are in fact well identified partial values that are called universal and imposed on them, although they are not universal. Just certain group of, let's say, the European countries say that this is universal and impose on different culture or different group of people, especially. This, of course, this approach is quite well spread in non-European countries that criticize that international documents are basically exclusively based and reflect Western concepts of law and politics, and even, as I mentioned, that human rights movement is considered by some of the critics as extension of colonialism. And to solve the problem and also the inflation, etc., of the human rights, and reconstruct in a way that human rights should also reflect different approaches, that the assessment should take into consideration the national traditions, cultural specificities. But this is a kind of reconstruction of the everyday use of human rights at the international arena and universal level. But nevertheless, this, of course, is introducing non-European concepts like teachings of Gandhi, Indian spiritualism, or Amartya Sen is a very popular, his theory, not coincidentally. Further question for the reconstruction would be the role of ethics in politics. It's a question that was on the agenda since the early modern times, let's say since Machiavelli and so on. And even I think that even the skeptics of the role of ethics and moral values in human rights acknowledge that with a certain limit, certain values, ethical norms in international relations cannot be ignored. So cannot build an international order where these values, all ethical values, moral values, are excluded from the relation of the countries. So further response goes as far to speak of a kind of new human rights revolution, and this is based more or less what I already addressed, the problem that instead of the negative concept of human rights against the state, jurisprudence should be further developed that puts elaboration and emphasis on positive obligations of the state. I'm just going through here. I just let's give an example now, going to the European Court of Human Rights, because in the recent jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, it clearly divides between the negative obligations of the state and the positive obligations. I mean, the classical view that negative obligations require states not to interfere with the exercise of rights, then, and that was inherent in the original text, in the original concept of the European Convention of Human Rights. Now the positive obligations of the states has also a strong role, but this is based on the jurisprudence of the Strasbourg Court. So the Strasbourg Court invented and developed the positive obligations doctrine, and that means that here the state is required to take action in order to secure persons within its jurisdiction to be protected by the convention, like, for example, that certain groups of people are in danger because of the concrete case was in the Transnistrian Republic, so a territory governed by Russian friendly military groups on the territory of Moldova, and here the applicants asked the court to give order to the state of Moldova, to protect them against this intrusion, that they were put under the rule of this group of military groups, basically very close to Russia. And this went to the Grand Chamber, where the Grand Chamber of the Strasbourg Court tried to justify that the state has positive obligations toward the persons within its territory, so the state does not violate any of the rights of these people, but as these people are now under the rule of the military groups, the state has to intervene to protect these people against this legal, internationally not accepted rule by foreign troops or troops close to a foreign country. But then of course the question is raised, that how can the court intervene and how can the state react to this kind of obligation by the court? Here the court, how to say, it's very restrained in the sense that says that it's not for the court to indicate which measures the authorities should take in order to comply with their obligations most effectively. It must verify that the measures actually taken were appropriate and sufficient for the present problem. When faced with a partial or total failure to act by the state, the court's task is to determine to what extent a minimum effort was nevertheless possible and whether it should have been made. Determining that question is especially necessary in cases where the infringement of the so-called absolute rights, the right to life and the protection against torture, are guaranteed. So here we see that originally they invented this to put obligation on the states without putting an impossible or disproportionate burden. So for they don't say that what should the state do, don't know, intervene, etc., but leave it free. Of course, this is also a kind of, how to say, avoiding the essence of the problem, as they do not indicate what to do, and the state should invent how to protect his citizens on this problematic territory. To turn to a more peaceful version of these positive obligations that was also much more successful, there was a Polish case that was very closely connected to the changes that happened up in the 90s, when not only the Council of Europe changed by adopting more dozens of new, so to say, new democracies, but also the court was changed from applications made by a commission or by the state themselves. They opened up the possibility of the individual applications by all citizens on the territory basically of entire Europe, and also they changed the structure of the court, but I will speak of that tomorrow. But nevertheless, here, after these changes, basically that make possible the individual applications for everybody, of course that thousands and thousands applications arrived from the citizens of those countries, especially from the new democracies, Russia, Poland, and Romania, etc. And here they faced the problem that basically the same problem is raised in hundreds or thousands in applications. And then the court invented a solution that it has to pick one of these cases, and if it decides this case, then it declares that this is a so-called pilot judgment. Mm-hmm. So the state has to solve the problem probably by way of new legislation. And in that case, if the state solves the problem, that the other thousands of applications are deleted, are struck out. And the first that the court implied this solution was in a Polish case, the Broniowski versus Poland, and here the issue was compensation for the land, for lands that were abandoned by the former owners because the state boundaries were changing. So I mean that the boundaries Poland and the Soviet Union were changed, and then a lot of territories on the banks of a river were abandoned, and then after the changes in the 90s, they were claiming back not the original territories, but a compensatory land for those territories that were abandoned there as they became the territory of the Soviet Union. And here there was a property issue was there, so not the classical freedoms, which says the convention says that every person has a right to peaceful enjoyment of his or her possessions. And here the court said that the general duty to secure to everyone the rights and freedoms defined in the convention, in this case means that the state has to take positive obligations, ensuring the effective exercise of the rights, namely the rights of the peaceful possession of property. Then the court was saying that what is the difference between the negative and positive obligations, and said that although they are very different in their nature, the principles to be applied are basically the same or very similar. So I mean the test for the interference with the right is more or less the same, that the court has to strike a balance, a fair balance between the competing interests of the individual and of the community as a whole. A balance between the demands of public interest and the applicant's fundamental rights. And of course, if in this balancing procedure, in the balancing exercise, the state has quite free hand, rather free hand, certain margin of appreciation, determining the necessary steps. And finally, I have referred several times to the problem of the economic interests and to the primacy of human rights. The thing that I will very shortly address at the end would be this problem of the business and human rights, because this is a new approach to the human rights. And actually, one of the possible ways to reconstruct human rights in the field, in the economic field. This is that there is a process that once is underway, the preparation of an international treaty on human rights regulation of transnational business activities. In the new millennium, interstate cooperation seemed to be indispensable to address the human rights challenges of globalization or digitalization. It's precisely the cross-jurisdictional nature of business operations and the lack of adequate state regulation that typically poses a threat to human rights. At the same time, it's important that the international treaty does not seek a supranational solution, or not only a supranational solution, but on the contrary, offers a remedy by strengthening national constitutional values. So here what was already been adopted was the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is the part of the United Nations program on human rights, and wants to protect the human rights against the abuses committed by third parties, not by the state, but by third party business enterprises, the global firms and so on that are on their territory and are their jurisdiction. And here the situation is even more difficult, because not that only the state sovereignty is involved in the composition, so that was very difficult to accept even for the states to have again a new international forum above the states that would try to protect themselves. On the other hand, also the state realize that they have to protect themselves against the transnational, multinational business environment that basically is above, to a certain extent, above the laws and the governments. I was member of a lobby group. Actually, this was a lobby group. I was invited, not member. I was invited to a lobby group that basically was formed by the greatest multinational companies in pharmaceutical, energy sector, food sector, etc., etc. It was a very shocking experience, by the way. But then, when, for example, chief legal advisor of a company producing water and chocolates and food, saying that their mandate is to bring water to thirsty people in other continents and so on. And so there's very human attachment. And then I realized that these multinational companies have only two enemies. One enemy basically is the competition authorities. The competition authorities that from the United States to European countries might have power to a certain extent over them. And then after this UN Business and Human Rights program was introduced, then they realized even human rights might be a problem for them. So then they started to invite to these meetings leading judges and from both from international and national constitutional courts to persuade us that they just have very human purposes. They want to help, nothing to do with profit and so on, and persuade us that they respect fully human rights. Sometimes it was very strange and to hear how these multinationals are protecting the rights of their employees and so on and so on. I was almost moved by this issue, and then here I see that the problem is that economic interests prevail over human rights and over social rules. And I myself had a very sad experience with this when the government introduced the first measures, the first attack against the Constitutional Court where I was president. Then nothing happened. International community was silent. I spoke with the I was not running to ask help, but just I was amazed that it's okay that the powers of the Constitutional Court, because of a political conflict, are limited by the Parliament. I spoke with the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, Jagland was a Norwegian, and I realized that a Norwegian politician does not understand the problem, because told me that half of the European countries are very democratic without having a constitutional court, but that's okay. But here, including his country, here the problem is that there was a constitutional court, the constitutional court's powers have been limited, were limited by the government. That's okay. What happened next year? This government attacking the Constitutional Court, still in power, introduced 18 special taxes, and these 18 special temporary taxes were all addressed to multinational companies in the pharmaceutics, telecommunication, etc., and in all these fields. What happened a week later? The president of the German Chamber of Commerce called me. This is the end of the world. No rule of law anymore in Hungary. This attack against the Constitutional Court that happened a year before is unacceptable. Let me go to them, meet them, and say that this is unacceptable. I told them, okay, that's fully agree. Just the timing is strange. That 1 year ago, you had a year to realize this attack, and you realized a week after that the taxes on the multinational companies, including mostly German companies, was introduced into Hungary. And this was the first experience for my naivety on the relation of human rights and economics interests, but then it unfortunately was not the only and last one. Of course, this economy is becoming increasingly global, leads to an increase of employment, a lot of good sites, but also these transnational corporations are actively violating civil rights in order to make profits, of course. This mainly concerns labor rights, discrimination based on gender, age, nationality, violation of the rights of individuals or groups. Such became a global threat, and this is not under the control of this classical scheme of protecting human rights, either on the national level or on the international fora. So this led to the realization that the operation of transnational corporate networks, which are becoming global institutions, has a direct impact on almost the entire spectrum of human rights, from freedom of assembly, protection of human dignity, and preservation of environmental values, to say another example. The principles that this UN initiative tries to introduce is summed up in 3 words: protect, respect, and remedy. That means that the states have to respect, protect human rights and fundamental freedoms against these transnational companies. This is protect. The businesses are special functions that must comply with all applicable laws and respect for human rights. That's a corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and the need to have adequate and effective remedies for violations of rights and obligations, to access to remedy for those whose rights were violated by these entities. In addition to the regulation of direct legal obligations on transnational corporations, the creation of a new legally binding instrument has been mooted that, that this international treaty is under preparation, that would subject all transnational corporations under their jurisdiction to a more rigorous system of control than the current one. And of course, the states have to express their consent to this new control mechanism, which also affects the states, as my experience with the German Chamber of Commerce was, that they were affected by this, and then they wanted to, of course, use the rule of law as just a justification for their economic problems. So I see this as a positive development. Of course, I'm skeptic how states and which governments could be persuaded to sign this treaty if it will be ready. The literature is divided. There are very optimistic views on the issue. There are pessimistic views. Being invited to this lobby organization, I see that really, I realize that the transnational corporations are afraid that this will somehow will be introduced. And of course, it is difficult to find international forum for this, for how to remedy these problems. Here, there are some more very imaginative authors that even plan to establish a World Court of Human Rights, among others my friend Martin Scheinin from the European University of Florence. I mean, this World Court utopias, I'm very reserved with them, but anyway, I think that this problem of the business and human rights should anyway be addressed. Just for a conclusion of this very first lecture, I would say that what I wanted to present to you, that the natural rights were turned into enforceable positive rights, and that opened up a new stage in the history regarding this the human rights protection. We have seen one of the problems, and then tomorrow I want to go into concrete examples, much more, how to say, digestible examples of the relation of the universal, the regional and particular human rights concept, how interact with each other. And then the third element, I wanted to at least to present some possible ways out for the reconstruction of human rights after the deconstruction era, like the realistic approach, new developments at the business, the regulation of business and human rights. Tomorrow, I'm going to mention the judicial practice and how these contradictions are faced, especially when the universal and particular character or international rules against state sovereignty are solved in the practice of international courts, and first of all by the European Court of Human Rights, and what kind of techniques are used for these everyday solutions that can accommodate still the protection of human rights with the demands of the states at this stage, still protecting their sovereignty, and also the relation of the international judicial bodies with the domestic judicial authorities. So that for the first one, and I would stop here. Even if I am loving my voice, I think you are not necessarily so. And then I open, if you have questions at this stage, of course, don't hesitate to ask me. Yes, please.
It's turned on. Okay. So I have a series of questions, but
Great.
I hope that you would try to answer the last one of these, because they are it's a sort of a chain of questions. My concern is mainly philosophical in the matter, so I hope that the questions do not seem too naive. The topic that I'm trying to broach here is that of the transition between human and natural rights that you tried to touch upon. So the first question, I'll go through all of them. Can the category of human rights exist independently from a theoretical commitment to the category of human nature? Is the first question. Can the category of human nature exist independently from the category of rationality? Is the second question. The third is, can rationality, when it comes to the determination of human rights, be ontologically separated from decision in a Schmittian sense? Here I'm referring to the decisionist character of the Hobbesian social contract itself. And the last is, and this is my actual question, can we reconcile the existence of human rights with its lack of a metaphysical foundation, given that the prerequisite for its positivization was the practical overcoming of metaphysics?
Okay, thank you for these questions that are really touching upon the subject, but in particular parts that I have not addressed, because I saw that even still I'm too theoretical at this introduction, and will encourage you to follow my further lectures. Yes, of course this was the Hobbesian view of the men living in the nature are rational, and this rationality leads to the social contract, because they want to survive, to defend themselves. As Locke put it even more practically, that you can protect your life, you can protect your liberty, not necessarily because as when you are, for example, sleeping, it's difficult, but you cannot bring with you all the time your property. So therefore, in his view, the property that made necessary the social contract. This was based on the classical Enlightenment rational and rationalist approach, which for me, so I'm not how to say reflecting on the advantages and deficiencies of this approach, but just wanted to underline that the turning point, that when these rights that according to positivists were considered imaginary issues and imaginary laws were turned into positive rights. Then your question regarding the metaphysics will also say you can justify the human rights both on a metaphysical thing, both on a simply positivist view, but you asked on the decisionist approach, which maybe I don't understand well your question, but is of course that Carl Schmitt was Hobbesian in a certain sense. So for him, Hobbes was that on which based his political theory, where the decision was in the center, in the sense that the sovereign is who takes the decision. By the way, I'm sorry to make this personal. I was the first work of Carl Schmitt translated into Hungarian was the political theology, and who translated this, is now very close to you. And basically, Carl Schmitt was unknown in Hungary, and then became maybe a bit over even emphasized. But what is actually this last question that? Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
This is the contradiction, basically, that you were referring to.
Yes, yes, yes. No, how to say? If my personal position would be that metaphysics was not, how to say, necessary to. So I am not saying that we have positive rise because metaphysics was overcome. Or especially, I'm not saying at all that metaphysics should be overcome in order to achieve positivism. I don't share this legal positivist view that I quoted just from Bentham, but I could a lot of other people's, because I think that the ideas, and especially this was the natural law, have an impact even without being positivist. So I mean that the strengths of the ideas I respect and I agree. There's another issue than what I thought to underline, that turning into positive rights and positive obligations that gave a much more chance. But I think all the issues I mentioned, for me, are still open and existing contradictions, and which make difficult the, how to say, the life of human rights, both in universal or more relativist sense, because these contradictions are inherent in the problem, and cannot say that now, okay, we overstep metaphysics and we could turn into positive rules. We don't need any more metaphysics and the problem is solved, because unfortunately the problem is not solved as it returned after the Second World War, and even now it's might be open to further changes, especially as these solutions to solve the problems are so far not very convincing. So I mean that they have to further elaborated.
Yes, there is a question, may you hear?
Hello. My question.
No.
Pro.
No.
Does it work? Okay.
Yeah.
My question is it working?
No, to pick this.
I think it's working. Yeah. Earlier you mentioned the institution of International Criminal Court, which is very important in the field of international criminal law. But one paradox is that, for example, the United States, which is actually has been one of the negotiators for creating the Roman Statute, is not actually a state party of these institutions. While at the same time other states like I don't know, Palestine managed to achieve to join this independent institution, which is important for the criminal law. And my question is basically whether the choice of joining or not institutions like this can be instrumentalized somehow for political reasons or not, because it deals basically with human rights. So I don't know. I was wondering if over the time there could be some paradox, or this is just my feeling. That's all. Thank you.
Yes, yes, I understand your problem, which shape that. The problem is that, let's say, I just mentioned Russia, didn't want to mention Russia and United States in one sentence, but these two big powers are not members of the International Criminal Court. Of course, that's a deficiency already in itself. But that means for me again that I just touched upon shortly in the introductory conversation, that human rights cannot be extracted from politics and political power, because this is a political game. Of course, if you say that human rights are universal, then you think ideally that all countries are running there and consider themselves equal, while not the situation at all. There are different considerations beyond the countries that are joining the, for example, the Rome Statute regarding the International Criminal Court, and this, for me, it's clearly a political decision itself, and that's what my fear is with the business court, where, in my view, regarding international criminal acts, is still much more consensus among the states and more standards than regarding the business issues, where the interests are even much more, how to say, economic and financial character. So therefore I'm a skeptic with this initiative. Also, I must say that I'm in favor of these developments, but much more reserved as regards, much more skeptic regards the result. Nevertheless, I think that, and this is also, that shows that universality is a goal, and the other hand is a political necessity, which basically keeps out countries that were, let's say, initiators of this whole kind of court, or with I will address tomorrow that United Kingdom, that was basically the founder of the Council of Europe, now is continuously frightening the Council of Europe that they would leave the Council of Europe as well. So I mean, these are clearly the political considerations and results of political power manifestations, and which otherwise the International Criminal Court has a very important mandate within the limited circle of states, of course. And very.
Thank you.
My question is more personal, if I may, and it stems out of curiosity about something that you said towards the start of the lecture about how your mother was surprised that you were admitted to the Strasbourg court because you had been critical of it in the past. So my question is, what did you find yourself being critical of regarding the Strasbourg court, and how is that now changed that you're part of it, if it has changed at all? And what are the meeting points now? So what can you say you agree with and feel represented by regarding the actions and decisions of the court?
Okay, so, as the first part of the question, I will now answer shortly, and I will more address it more in details tomorrow. So my problem was, I mentioned a half sentence, my problem was that we in the Hungarian Constitutional Court introduced very high standards for the protection of certain rights especially for example, freedom of speech. The Hungarian court went, didn't go again. We saw that we set higher standards, but that resulted that, for example, in the acceptance of hate speech, the standards by the Hungarian court were not the European standards that basically accept the ban on hate speech, but was the American standard. That the hate speech is also part of the free speech, and if you can make distinctions, that hate speech and a slippery slope, as I used to say, that might end in the limitation of all kind of speech. And then I will show you the examples when the Hungarian Constitutional Court at the later stage, using the arguments of the Strasbourg Court, was lowering the standards of the protection of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And I was invited to the Strasbourg Court, as that time I think I was vice president of the Hungarian Constitutional Court, and then I attacked this approach. No, I didn't attack, just I said that this might have a controversial effect on the national courts because they can say that you can lower. Of course, I have to say that nowadays the problem in Hungary is not to lower the standards to the European standards, but not to go under the European standards. So that's different, and of course this always depends on the historical moment. And otherwise, so that what my mother was reading and was surprised. But I even, as member of the court, of course we have a mandate. So it's how to say, it's also part of our work, and therefore I can be here now and not to stay in Strasbourg. That to disseminate informations on the court, not necessarily say that we are the best or the nicest in the world, just that to get acquainted people, lawyers, students with the functioning of the court, etc. I still keep up my certain criticism or consideration or reservations regarding certain practice of the court. Of course, I try to be polite. For I was invited to a conference on freedom of speech and on the digital era. I tried to present a judgment of the court, which in my view is one of the worst. And I will tomorrow and the day after also nominate some other very problematic judgments. But I tried to be polite and say that what is interesting in this French case is interesting, but approaching the problem of the internet users tries to share the responsibility before the different users of the Facebook, etc., etc. But I couldn't cheat the audience because they stepped up and said that this judgment is terrible. A colleague of mine says that he was also at a conference speaking of this judgment. This is the Sanchez versus France, and they were not critical there. I don't know. I really tried to. I didn't make any critical remarks in my presentations. Just wanted to show a certain positive side of the judgment, which some of those present shared. That the shared liability of the different components of the use in internet. It's a positive approach. It's a new approach, a novel approach, but they were very critical with the court was also divided, but still there are some of the judges supporting it. Some of the judges is really very desperate because of it. It's difficult. I couldn't find out during almost 7 years that how our minds are working. I more or less fortunately understand my approach, but according to clear standards, I am not able following sometimes where the people move to the majority with a completely different argument or vice versa. So,
Thank you.
Okay, I think.
Yeah. Domanda? Yeah, a question
No,
here.
there's questions.
Thank you. My question is, if do you think, basing on the on this lecture and basing on your personal experience, if universalism and relativism of human rights, if a possible part of the solution is the interacting of these two aspects, and if a part of the solution may be in the roles of the international courts, because you said that the European Convention of Human Rights is a regional convention, but it considered universal rights. So if this role is a possible part of the solution.
Yes, I think so. Of course, my personal beliefs, and also coming back to the first set of questions by the colleague, that I consider the basic rights actually, which are in the convention, the original text of the convention, to a certain extent, really in a kind of universal rights that apply for all men. So let's say that we can also put in a metaphysical basis in this sense. As for the relation of this universalistic approach in general and the relativism that was raised by there's a lot of critics, and which also the Strasbourg Court shares responsibility, because using rights that are not at all in the language of the convention. For this, I am how to say, uncertain. So I don't see a clear solution how to balance. Here I see, as I mentioned in the first set of questions, and also that here I think that there is an inherent tension that we have to live together with these tensions and this problem of balancing between them. And I don't think that there will be in the near future or at all a final solution for that. So I think that we'll declare that they're universal and enforceable, positive human rights, so that will be a continuous interaction and tension. And my view, just that the problem which I share with the critics, and that this deconstruction of the University of Human Values, despite the very popular character of the deconstruction, philosophical, linguistic, human, whatever school, it made more harm than advance for the general effection of human rights. So I honestly have to say that I have no solution for that, although I became famous at the court because there was a case, the Grand Chamber, and then we have to say that we are going to ask from the parties questions, not necessarily indicate exactly, but then I was the national judge of the Hungarian case. The president of the court asked me that, Peter, do you have any further questions? And I said that, no, President, I don't have questions, I have only answers. And they like it very much, but this was, of course, it was a theater and not the truth, because I have much more questions than answers in the field of human rights.
Thank you very much.
Any further questions?
No, I think we exhausted, even if not the topic, but at least ourselves. All right.
Okay, well, Peter, thank you very much for this first lecture. And the next meeting will be held tomorrow morning at 9, always here, for the second lecture of this series. Thank you very much to everybody, and have a good evening.